Of the holy exercises and occupations of the queen in the first year and a half of her infancy. The enforced silence of other children in their first years, and the slow evolution of their intellect and of their power of speech arising from natural weakness, was heroic virtue in the infant queen. For if speech is the product of the intellect, and as it were the result of its activity, and if she was in perfect possession of all her faculties since her conception, then the fact of her not speaking as soon as she was born did not arise from the want of ability, but because she did not wish to make use of her power. Other children are not furnished with the natural forces, which are required to open their mouth and move their tender tongue as required for speech, but in the child Mary there was no such defect. For as far as her natural powers were concerned, she was stronger than other children, and as she exercised sovereignty and dominion over all creation, she certainly could exercise it in regard to her own powers and faculties if she had chosen to do so. Her not speaking, therefore, was virtue and great perfection, which opportunely concealed her science and grace, and evaded the astonishment naturally caused by one speaking in infancy. Besides, if it is wonderful that one should speak, who according to the natural course ought to be incapable of speech, I do not know whether it is not more wonderful that one who is able to speak from her birth should be silent for 1 year and a half. Oh, boy. It was ordained, therefore, by the Most High, that the sovereign child should voluntarily keep this silence during the time in which ordinarily other children are unable to speak. The only exception made was in regard to the conversation held with the angels of her guard, or when she addressed herself in vocal prayer to the Lord. For in regard to intercourse with God, the author of speech, and with the holy angels, his messengers, when they treated in a visible manner with her, this reason for maintaining silence did not hold good. On the contrary, it was befitting that since there was no impediment, she should pray with her lips and her tongue, for it would not be proper to keep them unemployed for so long a time. But her mother never heard her, nor did she know of her being able to speak during that period, and from this it can be better seen what perfection it required in her to pass that year and a half of her infancy in total silence. But during that time, whenever her mother freed her arms and hands, the child Mary immediately grasped the hands of her parents and kissed them with great submission and reverent humility, and in this practice she continued as long as her parents lived. She also sought to make them understand, during that period of her age, that she desired their blessing, speaking more by the affection of her heart than by word of mouth. So great was her reverence for them that never did she fail in the least point concerning the honor and obedience due to them. Nor did she cause them any trouble or annoyance, since she knew beforehand all their thoughts and was anxious to fulfill them before they were made manifest. In all her actions and movements, she was governed by the Holy Ghost, being perfect in all her actions. Yet her most ardent love was never satisfied, but she unceasingly renewed her fervent aspirations to emulate still greater gifts. 1 Corinthians 12:31. The presence of the Most High continually preserved in this sovereign child the divine revelations and the intellectual visions. And if sometimes his providence suspended one kind of vision or enlightenment, she was enraptured by others, for from the clear vision of the divinity, which I have mentioned above, and which took place as soon as she was born and raised to heaven by the angels, Numbers 3:32. Number 332. I don't know if that's referring to something she wrote before. Maybe. She retained the images of what she had seen. Thus, coming from the wine cellar, where charity is set in order, Canticles 2:4, her heart was wounded with love, and returning ever toward it in contemplation, she was again and again set afire, body and soul, and all her being. As her body was yet weak and tender, and this love strong as death, Canticles 8:6, she soon felt the death pangs of love, of which she in her tenderness would have died, had not the Almighty strengthened her and preserved by a miracle the inferior part of her being and her natural life. Many times, however, the Lord permitted that this tender and virginal little body should be overcome by the violence of love, so that the holy angels might sustain her and comfort her in the fulfillment of the saying of the spouse. Quote, that's Latin. I'm not going to attempt that. Stay me up with flowers, because I languish with love, unquote. Canticles 11:5. And this, the most noble kind of martyrdom, was 1,000 times repeated in this heavenly lady, surpassing in it all the martyrs in merit and also in sufferings. The pain of love is so sweet and attractive that the more it prevails, the more it is sought, and he who suffers it longs to hear him spoken of whom he loves. Thus, seeking to be cured by renewal of the wound, this most sweet deception serves to keep the soul in suspense between a painful life and a sweet death. This was the state of the child Mary when speaking to her angels and hearing them discourse about her beloved. She asked them many times, saying, quote, "Ministers of my Lord, his messengers and most beautiful works of his hands, sparks of that divine fire which consumes my heart, since you enjoy his eternal beauty, unveiled and unrestrained, reveal to me the tokens of my beloved. What are his conditions? Tell me whether perhaps I have displeased him. Tell me what he desires and seeks of me, and do not delay in lightening my pain, for I am dying of love." Unquote. And the supernal spirits replied, quote, "Spouse of the Most High, thy beloved is the only one, he that is for himself, who has no need of anything, but of whom all stand in need. He is infinite in his perfections, immense in his greatness, without limit in his power, ineffable in his wisdom, without measure in his goodness. He gives a beginning to all things without having a beginning himself. He governs the world without asking consent, preserves it without having need of it, sees the beauty of all creation without ever being comprehended in his beauty by any one, and raises to blessedness by his beauty those who succeed in seeing him face to face. Infinite are, O Lady, the perfections of thy spouse. They exceed thy comprehension, and his high judgments are inscrutable to the creature." Unquote. In such colloquies and many others, too high for our capacity, Most Holy Mary passed her infancy, conversing with the angels in the Most High, becoming more and more like to him. I'm hearing a strange sound outside. Hold on just a second. Are you coming in? Come on. Come in the door. Cats. Was my Chihuahua and 2 cats. Okay. Sorry. I don't want to stop the video because I want it to be long enough, and I only have 50 free videos on this platform, so, you know, I don't know much about editing and stuff, so. I'm going to start again on this paragraph. In such colloquies and many others too high for our capacity, Most Holy Mary passed her infancy, conversing with the angels in the Most High, becoming more and more like to him. As her fervor and longing to see our highest good increased, being entirely enraptured by him, she was by the disposal of the Lord many times borne bodily by the hands of the angels to the empyrean heaven, where she enjoyed the presence of the divinity. On those occasions she would at times see God face to face, at other times by infused images of the highest and most godlike kind. She saw also the angels by clear and intuitive vision. Their degrees, orders, and hierarchies, and many sacraments were made manifest to her on each occasion. As these visions were often repeated, she gradually, by becoming accustomed to them, and by acts of virtue which she exercised in connection with them, began to appear more a divine than a human creature. No one else would ever be capable of such favors, and of others connected therewith, and even the mortal nature of that queen herself would have been deprived of life if she had not been preserved by a miracle. When in her childhood it was necessary to accept any service or benefit at the hands of her parents or of any other creature, she always received it with interior humility and thankfulness, beseeching the Lord to reward the good which they did in love toward her. Though she had attained such a high degree of sanctity, and though she was filled with the light of God and his mysteries, she nevertheless judged herself to be the least of all creatures, and whenever she made comparisons, she ascribed to herself the last place of all. Even of the nourishment necessary to sustain life, she considered herself unworthy, though she was the queen and mistress of all creation. Instruction given by the Queen of Heaven. My daughter, he that received more ought to consider himself more needy, since his debt becomes so much the greater. All should humiliate themselves, since of themselves they are nothing, nor can they do anything to possess aught. On this account, they that are raised up by the hand of the Almighty should humiliate themselves as mere dust. For, left to themselves and to their nothingness and unworthiness, they should esteem themselves so much the more indebted and bound to thankfulness for that which by themselves they can never repay. Let man acknowledge its condition, for no one can say, I have made myself, I preserve myself in existence, I can prolong my life or postpone death. All his being and preservation is in the hands of the Lord. Let each one, therefore, humble himself in his presence, and thou, my dearest, do not forget these truths. I wish also that thou esteem as a great treasure the virtue of silence, which I have practiced from my birth. By the light which the Most High gave me, I was conversant with all the virtues, but I attached myself to this one with great predilection, resolving to adhere to it as a companion and as a friend during all my life. Therefore I kept it inviolate, although I could speak from the moment of my entrance into the world. To speak without moderation and forethought is a two-edged sword, which wounds both him that speaks and him that hears, and thus in two ways destroys charity or hinders it in all the virtues. From this thou canst understand how much God is offended by the vice of inconsiderate and loose talk, and how justly loquacity and the tumult of disputation estranges his spirit and veils his presence. For those that talk much cannot keep free from grievous sins. Proverbs 10:19. Only with God and with his saints can one speak with security, and even then it must be with forethought and discretion. With creatures it is very difficult to preserve the golden middle without danger of passing from the correct and necessary to the imperfect and superfluous. The way to avoid this danger is to tend continually toward the other extreme, striving rather to reflect to be silent. For the prudent medium of speaking only what is necessary is found more in reflection than in immoderate speech. Remember, my soul, that thou canst not disport thyself in self-sought conversation with creatures without relinquishing God in the secret interior of thy soul, and that which thou canst not do without imprudence and insult in thy intercourse with other creatures, thou shouldest not do in thy dealings with thy Lord and the Lord of all. Close thy ears to the deceitful conversations which might induce thee to speak and what thou shouldest not. For it is not just that thou speak more than what is enjoined thee by thy Lord and Master. Listen to his holy law, which he has, with so liberal a hand, written in thy heart. Hear the voice of thy pastor, and answer him there, and him only. I wish to impress thee with the fact that if thou art to be my disciple and companion, it must be by signalizing thyself, especially in this virtue of silence. Reflect much, and write this doctrine in thy heart today, and attach thyself more and more to this virtue. For first I wish to see thee established in this, and then I will teach thee how to speak. I do not dissuade thee from speaking words of admonition and consolation to thy daughters and thy subjects. Speak also with those who can give thee tokens of thy beloved, and who can instruct and inflame thee with his love. In such kind of conversation thou wilt acquire a profitable silence of the soul, since in them is excited a horror and disgust for conversation of men, and thou wilt learn to relish conversation about the wished-for eternal good only. Then, with the force of love transforming thy being into that of thy beloved, the impetus of thy passions will weaken, and thou shalt arrive at that kind of sweet martyrdom which I suffered when I complained of my body and of mortal life, for they seemed to me a dreary imprisonment which hindered my flight, although not my love. O my daughter, forget all the earthly things in the hiding place of thy silence, and imitate me with all thy fervor and all thy strength, for thus shalt thou arrive at the state to which thy spouse invites thee. There thou shalt hear the consoling words which sustained me in the pangs of my love. Quote, my dove, dilate thy heart, and give admission, my cherished one, to the sweet pain, for my heart is wounded by thy love. Unquote. This the Lord spoke to me, and this thou myself hast heard repeatedly, for to those that are alone and in silence does his majesty speak. How the most holy child Mary began to speak at the age of 1 year and a half, and how she was occupied until the time of her departure to the temple. The time had arrived in which the most holy Mary could profitably and with perfect propriety break her blessed silence, in which the voice of that heavenly turtle dove was to be heard on our earth, in order that she might be the faithful harbinger of the springtime of grace. Canticles 2:12. But before she was commissioned by the Lord to speak with men, which was at the age of 18 months, she was favored with a vision of the divinity, not intuitive but intellectual, which was a summary of those already received and augmented the previous gifts and graces. In that vision, a colloquy took place between the child and the highest Lord, which I tremblingly presumed to reproduce in words. The Queen spoke to his majesty, quote, Most high Lord and incomprehensible God, how canst thou pursue with so great favors thy most useless and poor creature? How canst thou unbend thy greatness in such loving condescension toward thy slave, who is incapable of making the least return? The Most High looks down upon the servant. The Most Powerful stoops to enrich the indigent. The Holy of Holiest lowers himself to the dust. I, O Lord, am the little one among the creatures, and least of all deserve thy favors. What shall I do in thy divine presence? How shall I requite what I owe to thee? What have I, O Lord, that is not thine, since thou givest me being, life, and activity? But I rejoice, O my beloved, that thou possessest all the good, and without thee the creature possesses nothing. I rejoice that thou alone canst claim the glory of raising up the little one, of favoring the most useless, giving existence to nothingness, for thus thy magnificence shall become more known and exalted. Unquote. The Lord answered her and said, quote, My dove and beloved one, in my eyes thou hast found favor. Thine are the sweetnesses of my delights, my friend and chosen one. I will manifest what in thee shall please me most. Unquote. These promises of the Lord wounded her anew and made the most tender heart of the infant queen pine in throes of love, though it had already grown strong. And the Most High in his pleasure continued and said, quote, I am the God of mercies, and with immense love I am drawn towards mortals. Among so many who have by their faults offended me, I see some just, who are my friends and who have served me and do serve me from their heart. I have resolved to save them by sending my only begotten, in order that they may not be deprived of my glory, nor I of their eternal praise. Unquote. Beautiful. To this proposition, the most holy child Mary responded, quote, Most high Lord and powerful King, thine are all creatures, and thine the power. Thou alone are the Holy One, and the supreme ruler of all creation. Let thy own bounty move thee, O Lord, to hasten the coming of thy only begotten for the redemption of the sons of Adam. Let now the desired day of my ancient forefathers begin to dawn, and let mortals see thy eternal salvation. Why, O most beloved Master, since thou art a most kind Father of all mercies, dost thou delay so much the day, which thy captive and afflicted children expect with such longing? If my life can be of any service, I offer it gladly as a sacrifice for them. Unquote. The Most High urged her with great benevolence, and from now on she should many times each day pray for the hastening of the incarnation of the eternal Word, for the redemption of all the human race, and that she should bewail the sins of men which impede their salvation and restoration. Likewise, he told her that it was now time to exercise all her outward faculties, and that for his own greater glory it was befitting that she should converse with human creatures. Therefore, in order to comply with his wishes, the child said to his majesty, quote, Most high Lord and incomprehensible majesty, how can mere dust venture to treat of such hidden and exalted mysteries? How can she, who is the least of all the woman born, dare to converse of secrets so precious in thy sight? How can I win for men thy favor? And what can a creature do that has served thee for nothing? But thou, O my beloved, wilt be obliged by poverty itself. In thee the ailing will find health, the thirsty will find the fountains of mercy, and the strength to fulfill thy will. If thou ordainest, O my Lord, that I open my lips in order to converse and speak with others besides thyself, who art all my good and my desire, I beseech thee, consider my frailty and ward off the danger. Very hard it is for rational creatures not to fall into excess in conversation. If it is thy pleasure, I would rather keep silence during all my life in order to avoid all danger of losing thee, for if this should happen, I shall not be able to outlive it one moment." Unquote. This was the answer of the Most Holy Child Mary, for she was full of apprehension on account of the new and dangerous duty of conversing with men, which was now enjoined on her. As far as her inclinations were concerned, if God had allowed it, she desired to observe inviolate silence and be mute during all her life. O great confusion and shining example for the insipidity of mortals, that she who could not sin in speech should tremble at its dangers, and we who cannot open our mouths without sinning in our words are consumed with mortal longings after the dissipation of speech. But, O my sweet child and queen of all creation, how canst thou desire to remain silent? Dost thou forget, my mistress, that thy silence would be the ruin of the world, the sorrow of heaven, and also, according to our ignorant way of understanding it, a dreary void for the most blessed Trinity? Dost thou not know that even in a single one of thy words, namely, in thy answer to the holy archangel, "Let it be done to me according to thy word," Luke 1:38, thou wilt give the plenitude of perfection to all that exists? To the Eternal Father thou givest a daughter, to the Eternal Son a mother, to the Holy Ghost a spouse, to the angels reparation, to men redemption, to the heavens glory, peace to the earth, an advocate to the world, health to the sick, life to the dead. In this answer thou givest existence and reality to that which must be considered greater than anything else outside of his own essence, and greater than all the other works that God could decree and ordain. Since thus the greatest work of divine omnipotence and the welfare of all creation depends entirely on thy word, how canst thou desire to be speechless, O my lady and mistress? Speak then, O child who canst speak so well, and let thy voice be heard through all the vast circles of the heavens. With the most prudent answer of this spouse, the Most High was much pleased, and his heart was again wounded by the loving fear of our great child. Therefore, as if fully requited by their beloved, and as if conferring among themselves in regard to her petition, the three divine persons spoke those words of the canticles, quote, "Our sister is little and hath no breasts. What shall we do to our sister in the day when she is to be spoken to? If she be a wall, let us build up on it bulwarks of silver." Unquote. Canticles 8:8. Little thou art, beloved sister, in thy eyes, but great art thou, and great wilt thou be in our eyes. In this humility thou hast wounded our heart with one of thy hairs. Canticles 4:9. Thou art little in thy own judgment of and estimation, and this is what moves us with love for thee. Thou hast not as yet the breasts of nourishing words, but thou also art not a woman according to the law of sin, for in regard to thee this law does not hold, nor do we wish that it should extend over thee. Thou humblest thyself, though thou art great beyond all creatures. Thou fearest, though thou art secure. Thou guardest against a danger which cannot approach thee. What shall we do for this our sister on the day in which she shall open her lips according to our wish in order to bless us, while the mortals do it in order to blaspheme against our holy name? What shall we do in order to celebrate so festive a day as that in which she begins to speak? How shall we reward such humble modesty of her who was always the delight of our eyes? Sweet was her silence, and most sweet will be her voice in our ears. If she is a fortress, founded on the abundance of our graces, and made invincible by the power of our right hand, we will build upon such strong walls turrets of silver. We will heap new gifts upon the former ones, and let these, our turrets, be of silver, so as to make them more rich and precious. Let her words, when she begins to speak, be most pure, candid, strong, and full of meaning to our ears. Let our grace overflow from her lips, and let our powerful arm of protection rest upon her. Unquote. While, according to our way of thinking, this conference took place between the three persons of the divinity, our infant queen was strengthened and consoled in her humble solicitude concerning the first exercise of her speech. The Lord promised her that he would govern her words and assist her to direct them all toward his service and pleasure. Then she petitioned his majesty anew for his permission and blessing to open her lips so full of grace, and being prudent and considerate in all things, she spoke her first words to her parents, Saint Joachim and Anne, asking of them their blessing, and thus acknowledging that from them after God she had her life and being. The happy parents heard her, and at the same time they saw that she was able to walk by herself. The happy Anne, in great joy of her spirit, took her into her arms and said, quote, "My daughter and beloved of my heart, blessed and glorious to the Lord be the hour in which we hear thy words, and in which thou beginnest to walk in his holy service. Let thy words and sayings be few, well measured and considered, and let thy footsteps be directed aright towards the service and honor of our Creator." Unquote. The most holy child heard these and other exhortations of her holy mother Anne, and she engraved them in her tender heart to preserve them in profound humility and obedience. During the year and a half which remained of the 3 before her departure into the temple, she spoke but few words besides those addressed to her mother. For holy Anne, in order to hear her speak, was wont to call her and request her to speak of God and his mysteries. The heavenly child fulfilled her wish, listening to and asking questions of her mother. She that excelled in wisdom, all the woman-born, desired to learn and be instructed. Thus the daughter and the mother passed their time in sweetest colloquies concerning the Lord. It would not be easy, nor ever possible, to describe the doings of the heavenly child Mary during these 18 months of companionship with her mother. The latter shed copious and sweet tears of love and gratitude when at times she looked upon her child, more venerable than the symbolic Ark of the Covenant. Yet never did Anne reveal the secret of her heart, that her daughter was chosen to be the mother of the Messiah, although they often spoke of this ineffable mystery. At such times the child was inflamed with the most ardent love, and she spoke of it with the most exalted terms, innocently extolling her own dignity without being aware thereof, while her most blessed mother, holy Anne, was filled more and more with joy, love, and solicitude for her daughter and her heart's treasure. The strength of the tender child was by far inadequate for the fulfillment of the exercises and practices of humility to which her humble love urged her on, for this mistress of all creatures esteemed herself the lowest of them all, and was anxious to exhibit these humble sentiments in her actions by taking upon herself the most abject and servile occupations of the household. She feared that if she did not serve all that were with her, she could not satisfy her obligations and would fall short of her duty in the sight of the Lord, while the real cause of her not performing all that she wished was none other than the insufficiency of her bodily forces. And while the highest seraphim would have kissed the place where her sacred feet had touched, yet she was often full of holy fear lest she be deprived of doing the most humble services, such as cleaning and scrubbing the house. As she was not always permitted to engage in such things when others were present, she tried to do it when alone, being on such occasions assisted by the holy angels, and thus in a measure reaping the fruit of her humility through their help. The family of Joachim was not rich, though at the same time he could not have been called poor. Conformable to the honored standing of her family, Saint Anne desired to dress her most holy daughter as best she could afford, within the bounds of decency and modesty. The most humble child yielded to this maternal solicitude during the time of her voluntary silence without protest, but when she began to speak, she humbly asked her mother not to clothe her in costly and showy garments, but to procure for her garments of coarse and poor material, if possible such as had already been worn by others, and of ash-gray color, similar to that which in our day is worn by the nuns of St. Clare. The Holy Mother, who looked upon and respected her daughter as her mistress, answered, quote, "My daughter, I will conform to thy desire in regard to the form and color of thy dress, but thy strength will not permit the coarseness which thou desirest. In this regard I wish that thou obey me." Unquote. The child, obedient to the will of her mother and never objecting in anything, acquiesced and allowed herself to be clothed in the garments which were provided. They were of the color and form desired by her, and similar to the dress worn by children dedicated to a devout life. Although she desired them to be coarser and poorer, she supplied this want by obedience, deeming obedience more precious than sacrifice. 1 Kings 15:22. Thus the most holy child Mary had the merit of obedience to her mother and of humility in her aspirations, deeming herself unworthy of the use of even that which is necessary to preserve natural life. In the virtue of obedience toward her parents, she was most distinguished and exact during the 3 years of her stay with them. By her divinely infused science, she knew their interior wishes, and thus she was beforehand in fulfilling them to the minutest point. She asked the permission and blessing of her mother for whatever she undertook to do herself, kissing her hand with great humility and reverence. The mother outwardly permitted this, while inwardly she venerated the grace and exalted dignity of her daughter. At times she would retire to enjoy by herself and with greater liberty the company and intercourse of her holy angels, and to give outward tokens of the burning love of her spouse. In some of her exercises she prostrated herself, tearfully afflicting that most perfect and tender little body of hers for the sins of mortals, supplicating the mercy and blessings of God for them, and striving to gain these favors by the exercise of heroic virtues. The grief of her heart on account of the sins made known to her, and the pangs of love with which it was accompanied, caused in the heavenly child intensest sorrow and pain. Nevertheless, in order to be in all things the mother of mercy and the mediatrix of grace, she taxed also her bodily strength during that tender age in works of penance and mortification, sparing no exertion that time and opportunity permitted, in order to gain grace for herself and for us men. When she reached the age of 2 years, she began to exercise her special pity and charity toward the poor. She solicited alms for them of St. Anne, and the kind-hearted mother readily granted her petitions, both for the sake of the poor and to satisfy the tender charity of her most holy daughter, at the same time encouraging her, who was the mistress of mercy and charity, to love and esteem the poor. Besides giving what she obtained expressly for distribution among the poor, she reserved part of her meals for the same purpose, in order that from her infancy it might be said of her more truly than of Job, "From my infancy compassion grew with me." Job 31:18. She gave to the poor not as if conferring a benefit upon them, but as paying a debt due in justice, saying in her heart, "This my brother and master deserves what he needs, and what I possess without desert." In giving alms she kissed the hands of the poor, and whenever she was alone she kissed their feet, or, if this was impossible, she would kiss the ground over which they had passed. Never did she give an alms to the poor without conferring still greater favors on their souls by interceding for them, and thus dismissing them relieved in body and soul. Not less admirable were the humility and obedience of the most holy child in permitting herself to be taught to read and to do other things as other children in that time of life. She was instructed in reading and other arts by her parents, and she submitted, though she had infused knowledge of all things created. The angels were filled The angels were filled with admiration at the unparalleled wisdom of this child, who willingly listened to the teaching of all. Her holy mother Anne, as far as her intuition and love permitted, observed with rapture the heavenly princess, and blessed the Most High in her. But with her love, as the time for presenting her in the temple approached, grew also the dread of the approaching end of the 3 years set by the Almighty, and the consciousness that the terms of her vow must punctually be fulfilled. Therefore the child Mary began to prepare and dispose her mother, manifesting to her 6 months before her ardent desire of living in the temple. She recounted the benefits which they had received at the hands of the Lord, how much they were obliged to seek his greater pleasure, and how, when she should be dedicated to God in the temple, she would be more her daughter than in her own house. The holy Anne heard the discreet arguments of her child Mary, but though she was resigned to the divine will and wished to fulfill her promise of offering up her beloved daughter, yet the natural force of her love toward such an unequaled and beloved treasure, joined with the full understanding of its inestimable value, caused a mortal strife in her most faithful heart at the mere thought of her departure, which was closely at hand. There is no doubt that she would have lost her life in this fierce and vivid sorrow if the hand of the Almighty had not comforted her, for the grace and dignity of her heavenly daughter was fully known to her, and had entirely ravished her heart, making the presence of Mary more dear to her than life. Full of this grief, she said to the child, quote, "My beloved daughter, for many years I have longed for thee, and only for a few years do I merit to have thy company. But thus let the will of God be fulfilled. I do not wish to be unfaithful to my promise of sending thee to the temple, but there is yet time left for fulfilling it. Have patience until the day arrives for the accomplishment of thy wishes." Unquote. A few days before Most Holy Mary reached the age of 3 years, she was favored with an abstract vision of the divinity, in which it was made known to her that the time of her departure for the temple ordained by God had arrived, and that there she was to live dedicated and consecrated to his service. Her most pure soul was filled with new joy and gratitude at this prospect, and speaking with the Lord, she gave him thanks, saying, quote, "Most High God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my eternal and highest good, since I cannot praise thee worthily, let it be done in the name of this humble slave by the angelic spirits. Since thou, immense Lord, who hast need of none, dost look upon this lowly wormlet of the earth in thy unbounded mercy, whence this great benefit to me, that thou shouldest receive me into thy house and service, since I do not even merit the most abject spot of the earth for my place of habitation, but as thou art urged thereto by thy own greatness, I beseech thee to inspire the hearts of my parents to fulfill thy holy will." Unquote. At the same time, St. Anne had a vision in which the Lord enjoined her to fulfill her promise by presenting her daughter in the temple on the very day on which the 3rd year of her age should be complete. There is no doubt that this command caused more grief in St. Anne than that given to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, but the Lord consoled and comforted her, promising his grace and assistance in her loneliness during the absence of her beloved daughter. The holy matron showed herself prepared and ready to execute the command of the Almighty, and she answered full of submission by the following prayer, quote, "Lord God, Master of all my being, I have pledged to thy service and to the temple my daughter, whom thou in thy ineffable mercy hast given me. She is thine, and I return her to thee, with thanks for the time in which I have enjoyed her, for having been chosen to conceive her and assist in her formation. But remember, God and Lord, that in the keeping of thy inestimable treasure I was rich. I enjoyed her company in this desert valley of tears. She was the joy of my sorrow, the alleviation of my labors, the mirror for the regulation of my life, the example of a supernal perfection, which stimulated my remissness and enkindled my affections. Through that creature alone have I hoped for mercy and grace, and I fear that in being deprived of her I will fall away from all thy grace. Heal, O Lord, the wound of my heart, and deal with me, not as I have deserved, but look upon me as a kind Father of mercies, while I bring my daughter to the temple according to thy command." Unquote. God bless and keep you.